Hey guys, today we will be talking about the muscular system, which is chapter 8 in your book. The muscle tissue that we'll find in this system is broken up into three different types. We have skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and then smooth or visceral muscle. So skeletal muscle is also known as striated voluntary muscle. So when we look at it under a microscope, we see these lines of altering colors. So that's where that striated term comes from. And then voluntary is because we have control over how that muscle moves and when it moves. So if we think about flexing our arm, we can either flex it or not. It's completely up to us. It's a voluntary process. The skeletal muscle tissue is going to be found primarily attached to the bones, responsible for movement is its main function. The cardiac muscle is striated, so it has those alternating lines throughout it, but it's an involuntary muscle, so we don't have control over when the heart beats, how fast it beats. That's all out of our control, so it's involuntary. The only example of cardiac muscle is going to be the heart. And then our smooth or visceral muscle is also known as smooth involuntary muscle. So no striations are seen when we look at it under the microscope. And then we don't have control over the processes. And this is really found in any tube-shaped organ. So most people think of the intestines when they're thinking of the smooth muscle. But the throat, any gland, anything that's a tube-shaped organ. So the vessels, blood vessels are also an example of smooth muscle. The main function of muscle tissue is going to be contraction or the shortening of those muscle fibers. If we're talking about skeletal, then it's movement. Cardiac is to pump the blood. Smooth muscle is to push substances through it. So if we think of fecal matter going through the intestine, that's all done through the contraction of the muscle tissue. This just kind of shows you some examples of location and then what those muscle fibers look like. So you can see the striations on the cardiac and the skeletal muscle. So these lines here that are running throughout are those striations that they're referring to. The structure of skeletal muscle, the muscle itself is going to be composed of muscle fiber, the fascicles, and then the fascia. So the muscle fiber are fine threads of muscle cells. The fascicle is going to be groups of fibers held together by a connective tissue. And then the fascia is connective tissue that groups together multiple fascicles to form the muscle organ. So this is kind of like I think of a Russian nesting doll when we think of these. So our muscle fiber is going to be the smallest component of this, and then groups of those fibers are going to form fascicles, and then groups of fascicles are going to form the actual muscle organ. And then the fascia is the membrane that keeps those fascicles bound together. The regions of skeletal muscles refers mostly to the attachment point of those muscles. Almost all skeletal muscles are attached to bones with a movable joint between them. So really the only bone that's not going to have any sort of attachment to another bone is that hyoid bone in the neck. So when we're talking about origin, this is referring to the attachment to the stationary bone. The insertion is going to be the attachment to the movable bone, and then the body is actually the muscle organ itself. So if we look at this picture here, we can see it's referring to the biceps brachii here. So this is the biceps muscle. So the origin is going to be this section up here, mostly that tendon that's attaching to the stationary bone. The muscle body is the actual organ itself, and then the tendon that's attaching to the bone that moves is the insertion point. So when we're moving or flexing our arm, show off those big muscles, the radius and ulna are being brought up to the humerus. So they're the ones that are doing the moving, so that lower part or the distal portion of that muscle is going to be the insertion point. When we're looking at attachments to the bones, tendons are going to be the dense fibrous connective tissue that extends from the fascia and then attaches to the bone. The tendon sheath is going to enclose the tendon. The synovial membrane is just the lining of that tendon sheath, and then there's the bursa it's kind of like a little cushion or pocket that sits over top of a bony prominence to prevent the muscle from rubbing on that bone underneath. Without that bursa, we run the risk of essentially sawing the muscle in half from the bony prominence. So the structure of muscle fibers, they're connective tissue that's going to hold those fibers in parallel groups, allowing them to pull together in the same direction. So each muscle fiber is going to be made up of two different kinds of thread-like microfilaments. There's a thick myofilament and a thin myofilament. So the thick is formed from the protein myosin, which has a head that sticks out towards the thin myofilaments, which are made up of actin. The sarcomere is going to be the actual contractile unit, and this is composed of numerous thick and thin myofilaments. So if we look here, we can see the thick filaments. They almost look like the end of an arrow from a bow and arrow. And then the thin filaments are these little lines that kind of protrude. So what happens is when the muscle contracts, those thick filaments kind of ratchet those thin filaments closer together. So that's what's causing that shortening of the muscle. So that is called the sliding filament model, the contraction of the muscle fibers. So a nerve impulse is going to travel to the muscle fiber. The impulse triggers the release of calcium ions in the muscle cells, which then bind to the thin filaments and cause them to react with the myosin. The myosin forms cross bridges with actin, and then they kind of act as ratchets, pulling the thin filaments towards the middle, causing the muscle to contract. So that sounds like a lot of components. It's best not to overanalyze this process. So just know that the calcium is acting on the actin to react with the myosin. So we find that actin in the thin myofilaments, and the myosin is in the thick myofilaments. So the thick myofilaments are going to pull the thin filaments towards each other, shortening the length of that muscle. So that's what causes the contraction. Once the contraction is complete, the ratchets just kind of let go, and that's what causes the extension of the muscles. Or not necessarily causes the extension, but allows that muscle to return back to its normal size. So joints are going to be where two bones come together. Movement is going to occur at these joints between the point of origin and the point of insertion. So again, the origin is the portion of the muscle that attaches to the stationary bone, and the insertion is the bone that's going to move towards the origin bone. These groups of muscles will work together to produce a smooth movement. They're going to produce a single movement. So we have three different types of groups of muscle. We have the prime mover, which is responsible for producing a given movement. The synergist muscles, which are going to help the prime movers. And then the antagonists, which are going to oppose the action. So for biceps brachii is responsible for flexing our arm. That's acting as the prime mover. The synergist is going to be the brachialis, which runs along the side of that biceps brachii. So that's responsible for the flexion of the arm. If we're extending the arm, then the muscle fibers in the triceps brachii are going to contract, and that's the antagonist muscle. Tonic contractions, which are continuous low-strength muscle contractions, are responsible for our muscle tone and the posture. Another function of the skeletal muscle is going to be heat production. So the contraction of these muscle fibers produces most of the heat required to maintain our body temperature. That's why when we're cold, we shiver. That's a kind of constant contraction of those muscles in an attempt to warm up the core body temperature. Muscles will experience an amount of fatigue after repeated stimulation of the muscle fibers without an adequate period of rest. So if the stimulation is continued, the muscle will eventually just lose its ability to contract. So I'm a big fan of American Ninja Warrior. If you guys have ever seen it, where they're going along on those different areas of the competition and they just literally cannot physically hold on anymore. Their muscles have been stimulated to the point where they just cannot contract. So they just completely lose that ability to continue on. Oxygen debt is going to occur when an increased metabolism is required to remove excess lactic acid buildup and replace the depleted energy source. So an example of oxygen debt is labored breathing after exercise. When that oxygen supply runs low, the body then switches to an energy conservation, or energy conversion process that doesn't require oxygen. So that's what's going to produce that lactic acid buildup, which causes us to get that burning sensation in the muscles. And most likely, if we've experienced that, then those muscles will be sore the next day. There are multiple different body systems that are involved within the muscular system, to the point where the muscular system wouldn't be able to function without these different body systems. So the respiratory system is responsible for our oxygen production, which is required for movement. The cardiovascular system provides the blood to the muscles. The skeletal system, without that, the muscles wouldn't have anything to move. And then the nervous system is responsible for those impulses that cause that sliding filament model to take place. So if we're talking about the innervation of our muscle tissue, so the nerve that's going to be responsible for that stimulation is called the motor unit. So the components of that are the motor neuron, the neuromuscular junction, and then the muscle fiber. So when we talk about a motor unit, this is a single motor neuron and the muscle fiber that it innervates. So during this process, neurotransmitters, which are the signaling chemicals, are going to be released by the motor neuron. They'll move across the neuromuscular junction and then trigger the muscle fiber to contract. So this diagram just shows how that the motor neuron here attaches to all of those individual muscle fibers. So the neurotransmitter would go through the motor neuron, cross the neuromuscular junction, and then cause the contraction of these muscle fibers. When we're talking about muscle stimulus, there is a minimal level of stimulation required to cause a muscle fiber to contract, and that is referred to as the threshold stimulus. Once that threshold stimulus has been reached, the muscle fiber will contract completely. So what this means, this doesn't necessarily mean that the muscle organs, so the entire muscle, will all contract at once. It's a section of the fibers that are being stimulated. So if we're lifting just a little bit of weight, only a little bit of those fibers are going to be stimulated. If we're really lifting a heavy weight, lots of muscle fibers required, it could contract all of the muscle fibers within the muscle organ. So different muscle fibers in a muscle are controlled by different motor units. So each of those motor units has a different threshold stimulus level. So biggest thing to take away from this is that although the individual muscle fibers always respond all or none, the muscle as a whole does not. So it is possible to just stimulate a small section of that muscle. Now we'll talk about muscle contraction. So a couple different types. We have twitch contractions and tetanic contractions. So a twitch is a single contraction of muscle fibers caused by a single threshold stimulus. So a quick, jerky response. If you've ever fallen asleep and you're kind of startled out of sleep, you feel like you're falling out of air, that quick, jerky response is an example of a twitch contraction. This also occurs sometimes in the facial muscles, if you've had an eye twitch, or in the muscles after heavy exercise. Tectonic contractions are sustained muscular contraction caused by stimuli hitting a muscle in rapid succession. So this is a smooth, sustained response, such as the position, if we're maintaining a position such as lifting the leg or raising the hand and keeping it elevated, that would be an example of a tetanic contraction. And then we also have isotonic contractions, which produce movement at a joint and cause the muscle to change length. So in a concentric contraction, which is a type of isotonic contraction, the muscle is going to shorten at the insertion end of the muscle to move towards the point of origin. So this is going to be flexion, where eccentric, the muscle lengthens under tension, moving the insertion away from the origin. So an example of this would be extension. Anytime that a muscle is changing length, it's an isotonic contraction. So most types of body movements are going to be isotonic. Anytime we're moving something, it's isotonic. Isometric occurs when the contraction does not produce movement, so the muscle as a whole does not shorten. So if you try to lift something that's firmly attached to the ground and it doesn't budge, you just can't make it go anywhere, the muscle is still tightening, but it's not, or contracting, but the muscle as a whole doesn't shorten. So even though there's no movement, there's still tension within the muscle. So this just gives a visual of those two types of muscle contractions. So isotonic, same tension, but changing length. Isometric is same length, but changing tension. So the effects of exercise on our skeletal muscle. If we exercise regularly and properly, we will improve muscle tone and posture and have a more efficient heart and lung function while reducing fatigue. Our skeletal muscles are going to undergo changes that correspond to the amount of work that they do. So if you have a prolonged level of inactivity, you can experience what's called disuse atrophy, and that's actually when the muscle is going to shrink and become smaller, where regular exercise is going to increase that muscle size, resulting in hypertrophy. Strength training is exercise involving contraction of muscles against heavy resistance. So this is going to be your weightlifting. This is going to result in muscle hypertrophy, so those bigger, larger muscles. Endurance training is exercise that increases a muscle's ability to sustain moderate exercise over a long period of time. So running is a great example of endurance training. So now we'll talk about the specific movements that are produced by the skeletal muscle contractions. So angular movements, we have flexion and extension. So flexion is going to decrease in angle. Flexions are commonly described as bending, and then extension is going to increase in angle, so extending the joint out. Abduction is moving away from the midline of the body, while adduction is moving towards the midline or adding to the body. Circular movements are rotation, which is around an axis, circumduction, which is moving the distal end of a part in a circle. So rotation would be moving the head from side to side, shaking your head no. Circumduction is going to be, if you were to do kind of airplane arms where you spin your hands around, big wide circles, that would be circumduction. And then supination and pronation are hand positions that result from twisting the forearm. So supination, if you think of holding a cup of soup, that would be the position of your hands in supination. And then if you twist the hands down, that would be pronation. Excuse me. And then dorsiflexion is going to be the upward movement of the foot or the ankle. So the foot is elevated with the toes pointing upward. Plantar flexion is flexing the bottom so that the bottom of the foot is directly downward. So if you're standing up on your toes, you would be in plantar flexion. Inversion is turning the ankle so that the bottom of the foot faces towards the midline. In eversion, the bottom of the foot is going to point laterally. So here shows you flexion versus extension. And then we have rotation over here, so shaking the head, yes and no. Circumduction, supination, and pronation. Dorsiflexion, the toes are going up towards the shin. Plantar flexion, they're pointing down. Inversion, and then eversion. So there's a lot of great tables in your book, like this one, that will break up the muscles according to the part moved, and it shows them based on the movement that they produce as well, which is pretty nice. So it lists your flexors, extensors, abductors, and adductors. This is just an overall view of the muscles within the body. We'll kind of go through them individually. One thing to keep in mind when we're talking about the muscles is that they correlate, the names normally correlate pretty closely to the bones that they're attached to. Specifically in the head and neck, you'll really see it. So we have the muscles of the head and neck, facial muscles. The orbicularis oris is the kissing muscle. So this is responsible for puckering the lips. The zygomaticus is the smiling muscle, elevates the corner of the mouth. The masseter is going to elevate the mandible, while the temporal assists in closing the jaw. The sternocleidomastoid is going to flex the head, and then the trapezius elevates the shoulders and extends the head. So here you can see the zygomaticus, which is responsible for smiling. The masseter right here is going to elevate the mandible. Sternocleidomastoid flexes the head. The trapezius elevates the shoulders, extends the head. Muscles that are going to move the upper extremities are the pectoralis major, the latissimus dorsi, which runs along the back, the deltoid, which is on your shoulder, biceps brachii is the muscle of the upper arm, and then the triceps brachii runs along the back side of the arm. The muscles of the trunk are going to include the rectus abdominis here, which is the muscles responsible for a six-pack ab. Here you can see the latissimus, or excuse me, the pectoralis major. Here's a little bit of the latissimus dorsi here, but that's going to wrap around to the posterior side of the body. External obliques are here, while the internal obliques lie deep to those. Muscles of the lower extremities, the iliopsoas, gluteus maximus, adductor muscles, and then the hamstring muscles, which are composed of the semimembranosus, the semitendinosus, and then the biceps femoris. The quadriceps are responsible for extending the lower leg, and that's the rectus femoris and the vastus muscles. And then the tibialis anterior is going to run along the tibial, the tibia or the shin. The gastrocnemius is the calf muscle, and then the peroneus group is responsible for flexing the foot. That is located along the fibula. I would suggest utilizing that website that we kind of talked about last week, biodigital.com. That 3D model that they have is really excellent, and it gives you the ability to look at each individual muscle, see the insertion and the origin point, and kind of how it sits on top of those bones. Of course, if you have any questions, just let me know.